Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about the insidious strategy of SARS CoV-2. SARS CoV-2 has developed an insidious strategy to ensure its perpetuation in the host population in a way that it is capable of generating more infectious variants. And as I will try to explain, this capacity of the virus enables it to perpetuate in the host population. I think that lack of understanding of this insidious strategy of the virus is, at least to some extent, responsible for the fact that we are really struggling to control this pandemic. And I also think that lack of understanding explains why we are not handling this pandemic adequately, at least according to my opinion. So I made a number of slides just in order to explain you more clearly how exactly the virus operates and how it deploys its insidious strategy to ensure its perpetuation in the population, and what are the consequences thereof, essentially in terms of the natural course of the pandemic, but also the consequences of, for example, mass vaccination implementation. So let me share my screen. Here we go. So the title of my talk is Asymptomatic Infection Fuels the Spread of More Infectious SARS-CoV-2 Variants. So the fact that SARS-CoV-2 is capable of infecting people in a non-symptomatic way is an important attribute of the virus, because people who are asymptomatically infected with SARS-CoV-2 are able to spread the virus and basically constitute a source for viral transmission. So that is a little bit different from the situation seen with other viruses, for example, SARS-CoV-1, and also influenza virus, for example. So both have been responsible for pandemics. But in case of influenza, SARS-CoV-1, we see that people essentially spread virus, shed virus, when they get a disease. So they are not spreading, certainly not to a relevant extent, the virus before they are getting ill. And cases of asymptomatic shedders have not really been documented. Certainly not to an extent that they would be of epidemiological relevance, let's say. So this is different from the situation seen with SARS-CoV-2, where people can shed for some time a reasonable amount of virus before getting ill, after getting infected, and even people who never get a disease really, and do not develop symptoms, after infection, they can shed the virus for some time. And so, as I was saying, they constitute an important source of viral shedding and transmission. So SARS-CoV-2 has a highly insidious strategy. The virus can be shed and transmitted by asymptomatically infected people. And I will explain how this will ultimately promote the fitness and the propagation of immune escape variants that are capable of overcoming suboptimal immune pressure on the spike protein. And that due to this phenomenon, in fact, this phenomenon will lead to breeding of more infectious variants. So you have heard me a lot talking about suboptimal immune pressure in asymptomatically infected people, already in a number of talks and previous documents that I posted. I have been describing this phenomenon of immune suppression suppression in asymptomatically infected people by S-specific antibodies, suboptimal antibodies that appear in asymptomatically infected people shortly after they got infected, and to some extent these antibodies appear at a point in time where the infection or the virus has already been eliminated. So this is a statement. We are not now going to explain the details or in fact to provide a rationale for these statements. How does it come that because of asymptomatic infection and shedding, you finally end up with a situation where the virus ensures breeding of more infectious variants that can then ensure perpetuation of the virus in the host population. So first of all, natural COVID pandemic. I would like to give you an idea about the relationship or to describe a little bit more in detail the relationship that definitely exists between the infection pressure that is built up by the virus in a population and the occurrence of the second wave of disease. So the level of infection pressure determines, in fact, the time length between the first and the second wave. So we all know that the first wave primarily hits the vulnerable people, and vulnerable people are people, for example, who are immune depressed, elderly people who have whose immune system, innate immune system is waning, and of course also people, for example, with underlying diseases. So these people will essentially get the disease and be responsible for the first wave of disease. But after this first wave of disease, what you will see is that after it has come down, and after a certain period of viral quiescence, I would say, one will see that infection pressure will again steadily increase and then lead to a second wave of disease in an important part of naturally protected people. So if we look at people who are naturally protected, and this, they constitute basically between 65 and 80 or even 85% of the population. So a vast majority of the population has natural protection against COVID-19 disease. And this kind of natural protection could be considered really as herd immunity, because it protects the vast majority of the people. So if we now look at these naturally protected people, well, we will see that as a result, of course, of the first wave, a substantial part of these people will be asymptomatically infected. And what that means, or that has basically two consequences. When people get asymptomatically infected, and as I was saying, I have been describing this multiple times in previous presentations, they will mount suboptimal antibodies to a large extent. Not all of the people who are asymptomatically infected, but a substantial amount of them will mount suboptimal antibodies against spike protein. So suboptimal antibodies means these are antibodies that have lower affinity, that are not fully mature, that are directed against several different parts of the S protein, and that are also essentially short-lived. So in a fairly important amount of people who got asymptomatic infection, the antibodies will be against S protein will be short-lived. So now, on the other hand, these suboptimal antibodies, although they have lower affinity for the S protein and are oftentimes not even able to neutralize the virus, they can still bind strongly enough to the S protein to prevent natural antibodies that are not antigen specific, that prevent natural antibodies like IgMs from binding to the virus. So even suboptimal specific antibodies are capable of suppressing, in fact, innate immunity due to natural antibodies. So that is what I call erosion of natural immunity. So what I'm saying is that in a large part of asymptomatically infected people, you will see that there is erosion of their natural immunity. So that is one consequence. The second consequence is that the virus, after the first wave, will now spread more and more within this population of asymptomatically infected people. This is very clear because during the first wave, people who got the disease and are spreading and transmitting a lot of virus, they have been quarantined, have been isolated, treated, and ultimately people who survive build protective antibodies against the virus. So then the virus it can basically only spread within the rest of the population, and that are the asymptomatically infected people. So since these asymptomatically infected people, as I was saying, constitute an important part of the population, the level of infectivity can grow pretty fast. So these people are shedding, there is a large amount of them. And so the infection pressure after the first wave, and after the first wave has come down, can again, due to these asymptomatic carriers, grow at a fast pace and at a very or a relatively high level. So this will cause a second wave of disease in younger age groups. Well, how does this come? Well, when the infection pressure rapidly grows at a higher level, then the likelihood that people who got previously infected by the virus are now re-exposed to the virus at the time where they have suboptimal antibodies becomes increasingly higher. So this is to say that, in fact, the higher the infectious pressure, the faster the virus will spread, and the higher the likelihood will be that the virus will hit those people again shortly after their previous infection. So that means at a point in time, in fact, where their natural antibodies gets or experience maximal suppression by the suboptimal specific antibodies, because it's shortly after the previous infection that those suboptimal antibodies, S antibodies, have the highest titer. So because the likelihood increases that at that very point in time where the asymptomatically infected people are most susceptible, because this is the point in time where they experienced the biggest suppression of their natural immunity, there is a high likelihood, of course, or not a likelihood, the virus will be able to break through this innate immunity in a fairly large amount of people and in a way that it really causes disease because they have now their natural immunity suppressed. So this will cause a second wave of disease, and especially in younger age groups. Why younger age groups? Because, of course, these are the people who were previously protected and have the highest titers or the highest levels of natural antibodies. And those are exactly now the people who see their immune levels heavily suppressed because they are re-exposed to the virus very shortly after their previous infection. And that is due to the high speed of viral spread due to the steadily increasing infection pressure of the virus, which is due to very frequent transmission of the virus amongst several different subjects of the asymptomatically infected population. So what happens next? So this is what I said, the erosion of the natural immunity. But what happens next is then, as a consequence, of course, of this second wave, you will now have an additional part of the population, of this blue part, the part of the population colored in blue that was protected, and that is constituting part of the herd immunity. As a result of the second wave, an additional part of this population will get infected. And again, because their natural immunity is still strong enough, high enough, these people will now again experience asymptomatic infection. And as a result of this asymptomatic infection, again, a phenomenon that is similar to the one I previously explained, you will see an erosion of natural immunity now in this additional part of asymptomatically infected population. It will be, of course, a smaller part. And again, what happens here is that not only is this additional part of the population getting an erosion of their natural immunity, again, due to the fact that as a result of infection during the second wave, they have mounted suboptimal antibodies that outcompete, that are at least to some extent, the natural antibodies. So that explains the erosion. But on top, since the previously asymptomatically infected people, so during the second wave, have now built antibodies, protective antibodies. And again, as happened during the first wave, these people, when they get a disease, they get isolated, quarantined, get to the hospital, get taken care of, and they do no longer constitute, also as they build protective antibodies, a major source of the viral spread. The major source right now are these asymptomatically infected people. But since their number is now much smaller, when they spread the virus amongst each other, this will no longer lead, because it's fairly diluted, because the population is much less important in number. The infection pressure will now only grow slowly and to a lower level. So what happens when the infection pressure grows only slowly and to a lower level? Well, you could say that the lower the infection pressure and the slower the virus is going to spread, the higher the likelihood that the virus will hit these people again at a point in time that is further distant from the previous exposure that they got. And therefore, the likelihood that they are going to be exposed at a point in time where there is severe suppression is remote, because the virus spreads more slowly, and because it spreads more slowly, the likelihood that it is going to hit them at a point in time, not right after the previous infection, but at a more distant point in time, becomes higher. But at that more distant point in time, so more distant from the previous infection, of course, the suppression by the suboptimal anti-S antibodies is much lower. So that means that as the suppression is less important, the virus will no longer be able to really break through completely through the innate immunity of these people and make these people ill. But nevertheless, the infection pressure will still be sufficient, or will still enable local viral replication. So no longer disease, because the suppression is less important in most of the people, but still enabling local viral replication, and still, of course, on a background of suboptimal anti-S antibodies. And because this suboptimal immune status of anti-S antibodies prevails in still a fairly important number of people, they build now a breeding ground, or they serve as a breeding ground for more infectious variants that are going, variants that have occurred and that are now selected. Why? Because they are able to overcome the suboptimal anti-S antibodies. And this will basically lead to more infectious variants. Lead to more infectious variants, lead to dominance of more infectious variants. So more infectious variants that are not only selected, but can now also adapt to the population, because they very regularly find, upon transmission to another subject, a similar background of suboptimal anti-S antibodies. And that is what we see, for example, when you have, for example, the second peak. After the second peak, you have a period of quiescence, and we can see this in many of the curves in several different countries, that you see now a kind of plateau, but it is a plateau where that still has some level of infectivity. It doesn't go down to zero, so it occurs at a certain level of infectivity, a pretty low infection pressure background. But this plateau is really indicating the breeding of infectious variants. So it's not like nothing is happening there, or there is just a little bit of disease or a little bit of infection. No, this plateau indicates breeding of more infectious variants. And so what happens then? Well, because now you start having more infectious variants, you will again, of course, increase the infection pressure in the population. Per definition, dominant circulation of more infectious variants will increase the level of infectivity in the population. And ultimately, this infection pressure will increase till these more infectious variants still have, in fact, led to an infection pressure that is now capable of breaking through the innate immune barrier of those people. So of the people who previously asymptomatically resisted the second wave. So these are the people that have been breeding these infectious variants, and these infectious variants have been circulating now in the population of these people, have increased infection pressure. And thanks to this increase in the infection pressure, they are now capable, the virus is now capable of breaking through the innate immune barrier of these people. Similar to the situation here, because increased infection pressure will more easily be able to overcome the innate immune barrier. And that is basically what will lead to the third wave of severe disease. And this third wave of disease is now going to occur to some extent in people who have even a better natural, or initially had a better natural immunity than those who were affected during the second wave. So here you may even see that the age of the people who get the disease goes further down. So, of course, if you now implement stringent infection prevention measures, you will delay the second wave of disease in the previously protected people, while promoting breeding of infectious variants. So what this means is that if from the very beginning you manage to implement stringent infection prevention measures, then you will not allow the virus to rapidly mount an infection pressure at a very high level. Because of the infection prevention measures, you will keep for quite a long time a rather low infection pressure. But what I'm saying is that if you're dealing with low infection pressure, it will not easily be able to break through the innate immune barrier of asymptomatically infected people to an extent that these people get a disease, but it will still allow the replication of the virus and on the background of suboptimal anti-S antibodies. And this will lead to more infectious variants. So you decrease the infection pressure by implementing massively, for example, infection prevention measures. So you will have less disease very clearly. You will kind of like bypass this wave, the second wave. But the price you will pay is that you will have more breeding of infectious variants. And that is basically what we have been seeing after the first wave of infection. Remember, last year, after we had the first wave, we had a quite extended period of time before we saw these more infectious variants appearing, because it needs time to select them, to then adapt them to the population, especially since during this point in time, we have an infection pressure that is relatively low. So the spread from one individual to another is not as fast as it would occur, for example, when you don't implement any infection prevention measures. On the other hand, if you now introduce in the population a highly infectious variant, then you will expedite this phenomenon, of course, of the second wave. So this phenomenon of the second wave is due, as I was saying, to a mounting and increasing infection pressure that is due to the fact that a big amount of asymptomatically infected people are now transmitting the virus after the first wave. And because they are quite important in number, the infection pressure can build up pretty fast. But if on top now you introduce a variant that is already highly infectious in its own right, you will, of course, expedite this phenomenon, and you will get much faster to this second wave, and the second wave may also be more important. So that is what I'm saying here. The introduction of highly infectious variants will expedite this process. So now, next question, very important question. What happens now when you do mass vaccination? So you have these more infectious variants already circulating. That was the situation we saw. And last year, November, for example, where you had a number of these more infectious variants popping up. And then we started really rolling out these mass vaccination campaigns. So what is the effect of rolling out these mass vaccination campaigns on a background of more infectious variants? Well, in fact, what this will do is that this mass vaccination will enhance the immune pressure that is exerted on the infectiousness of these variants. And this even regardless of the viral infection pressure in the population. So why is this? Well, this is because the mass vaccination, will induce antibodies against the receptor binding domain of the S protein. So the receptor binding domain is situated within the S protein, and it binds with even higher affinity to the AC2 receptor on susceptible cells, respiratory epithelial cells. And because it binds with a higher affinity, it will put more pressure. So the antibodies that are raised against this domain will put even more pressure on the S protein, which is responsible for the infectiousness. So that's why I'm saying it will enhance immune pressure exerted on the already higher infectiousness of those variants. And this will be regardless of the viral infection pressure. So how can it now exert this pressure? Well, it's always the same rules. You can only derive this evolution provided your immune pressure is suboptimal. And as we know, in a fairly important amount of vaccinees, this immune response against the S protein, so especially against the receptor binding domain, will be suboptimal. And that is for several reasons, as I already explained before, because when we vaccinate people, they need time to seroconvert. During this seroconversion, where their antibody response is, of course, suboptimal, they are already under attack of the virus, because we are in a pandemic and the virus is really spread broadly in the population. Also, during the time where these people are waiting for the second vaccination, the antibody response may still be suboptimal. And again, you have the combination of infection combined with exposure of the virus to suboptimal immune conditions, which can really drive then the immune escape variants to adapt to the suboptimal conditions, because they are present in an important number of vaccinees. And of course, as we have already more infectious variants circulating, also the match between the antibodies, the vaccinal antibodies, and the S protein of those more infectious variants is, of course, less good than the match of those of these vaccinal antibodies with the S protein of the original, of the wild virus. So conditions here are fulfilled. You have suboptimal conditions. The virus, the variants are already more infectious, but now you put additional pressure because the antibodies are no longer the suboptimal. And when you the more you vaccinate, the antibodies that need to be overcome, the function of which need to be overcome, are no longer the suboptimal antibodies that we have seen in asymptomatically infected people. We are now talking about the antibodies in vaccinated people, and they bind with higher affinity to the S protein. So you put more pressure on the virus to overcome this. So due to a suboptimal immunity in an important part of the vaccinees, and that is what mass vaccination does, it generates suboptimal immune condition in very large parts of the population, the viral variants will now increasingly select and escape mutations. They will increasingly select, so the end, that this is not right. So viral variants will increasingly select escape mutations within the receptor binding domain. So as I was saying, because this is the way now for the viral variants to overcome the additional pressure that is put on them by the vaccinal antibodies. And as those escape mutants that are able to overcome the immune pressure on the receptor binding domain will have a competitive advantage, they will now promote breeding of variants that are even more infectious. Variants that are even more infectious because they evolve to incorporating an additional amount of mutations in the receptor binding domain. And because they do that, they will be more easily capable of infecting susceptible cells. So this leads to higher infectiousness because the whole thing is occurring within the receptor binding domain that has the highest affinities, the most important component of the infectiousness of the virus. And finally, when this continues, it will lead to vaccine-resistant variants. And this, of course, I don't need to tell you what the consequences are of this. I mean, this is just, in fact, a pretty dramatic situation. So what I'm describing here is, again, to illustrate what is the impact of the level of infection pressure on the occurrence of an important wave of disease, including also younger subjects. Well, you see, for example, like in India, you have, for example, a background of pretty low, or you had a background of pretty low infection pressure. And it takes quite a long time, but it is a kind of plateau. And as I was saying, this plateau, in fact, represents the breeding of more infectious variants. And at a certain point in time, those infectious variants will now be dominant enough in the viral population to be able to increase infection pressure to an extent such that the innate immunity of asymptomatically infected people will be eroded sufficiently to break through that innate immunity and then give rise to a wave of disease. In other populations, for example, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, we had the introduction of a more infectious variant, namely the Brazil variant. And so the whole pandemic here is occurring on a background of a higher infection pressure, due, of course, to the appearance of the highly infectious Brazilian variant. And due to this, of course, as I was saying previously, the whole process of this second wave of disease and even severe disease is expedited. So now, as I was saying, mass vaccination is in fact promoting the breeding of this of this more infectious variants. And so you can see, for example, that whereas I would say in the absence of mass vaccination, I would not have expected such a huge wave in India. As I was saying, when the background is pretty low, it will take a longer time for the virus to mount an infection pressure that is sufficient to break through the innate immunity. And then, as you can see in this previous slide, we are talking about a fairly limited amount of people. But if you know, if you're now in fact strengthening, or you are making this increase in viral infectiousness of the virus more important due to concomitant vaccination, then you can imagine that you can immediately get to a wave that is already comprising, in fact, mutants that are not only more infectious, but that have even already evolved to some level of resistance really to the vaccine. And that could explain why this wave that we are now seeing in India, despite the fact that it started on a low infectious infection pressure level, is pretty important and pretty impressive. And the same here. If you put more pressure on a viral variant that is already highly infectious, so this one, the Brazilian one, has already evolved to a level of pretty high infectivity. And if you now come with mass vaccination, enhancing, in fact, the increase of infectiousness of these viral variants, then you can easily see that when this occurs, for example, a couple of weeks after mass vaccination got implemented, it can give rise to a much steeper even and a much higher wave of infectivity and disease. So it's also important to note that the effect of mass vaccination could be pretty impressive, as you see, for example, in India, as you see here in Canada, as you see in these other countries, even regardless of the level of the infection pressure that was present before this wave started. It was a kind of plateau or lower level. And so this also already indicates that the more we are going to vaccinate, the less important becomes the influence and the impact of infection prevention measures. Because these infection prevention measures, they were in the past capable of reducing this basic level of infectivity. But you see here, almost regardless of this basic level of infectivity or the base that you start from, you get a huge increase in infectivity and disease. So the more vaccination, the less important, the less impact infection prevention measures will have. So then my last slide, what about the efficiency of conventional vaccines to control a pandemic? So can we generally just say, well, conventional vaccines, and with conventional vaccines, I mean really, first of all, vaccines like the vast majority of vaccines, with the exception maybe of live attenuated vaccines, they have no sterilizing capacity. They do not induce sterilizing immunity. That is one thing. And I very often also label vaccines as conventional when they are simply mimicking the type of immune response that is induced by natural infection. And that is basically also what the current vaccines do. They basically mimic the natural immunity that is induced by natural infection, at least as far as the natural immunity or the immunity against the S protein is concerned. So what I mean with natural immunity here, or not the natural antibodies. In fact, what I mean is the immunity induced by natural infection. So are these type of vaccines able to control a pandemic? You could say, well, why not? Because what is definitely very clear is when you vaccinate with those vaccines, you will have an important impact on the viral load. You will significantly decrease viral shedding. And if you could decrease it at a point where the virus gets too diluted in the population and not finds fast enough another host to continue its viral cycle, well, then it could die out, and it could, this could mean, in fact, eradication of the virus, or at least complete control over the viral propagation. And you should get at a level where you have really complete quiescence, where no viral activity is seen anymore in terms of disease or significant levels of viral infectivity. So we need to be, well, I'm saying it is conditional. Yes, this could occur. You could use conventional vaccines to control a pandemic under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. Well, first of all, we need to realize, this is important to realize, because I very often hear people talk about epidemic and pandemic, meaning the same thing. It's not at all the same thing with the pandemic. We really mean that a new virus is getting into the population. And basically, the only immunity that population has is the natural immunity, which I was saying, for example, as far as SARS CoV-2 is concerned, it's basically between 65 and 85% of the population, a big chunk of the population that has natural immunity. But that is the only type of immunity that exists. There is no adaptive immunity because the adaptive immune system has not seen the virus before. So, mass vaccination could control and even eradicate the infection if and only if the following conditions are fulfilled. It should not be a highly mutable virus. This is very clear because you start building your antibodies through the vaccination, and then the virus is just taking on another code. And the antibodies that you generated are no longer recognizing the virus. So it's not very useful to use these vaccines if you're dealing with a highly mutable virus. The second thing is if you are on top having a reservoir of asymptomatic carriers, and this could even be an animal reservoir, then it's not very useful either, because on one hand side, you diminish the viral load by vaccinating people, so they will have less shedding of the virus, and the viral concentration in the population will diminish. But then you have this kind of reservoir that is continuously throwing virus back into the population. And so that will make your vaccine, you will not be able, of course, to eradicate or to fully control the pandemic or the viral infection, because from another a source, for example, an animal reservoir or asymptomatic carriers, you have continuously virus that gets again into that vaccinated population. So if this were not the case, if you would not be dealing with a highly mutable virus and you would not be dealing with asymptomatic reservoirs, then you could indeed use conventional vaccines to control the pandemic. But those conditions are absolutely not fulfilled in case of SARS-CoV-2, because here we are dealing with a highly mutable virus. And second, we do have asymptomatic carriers. And the asymptomatic carriers are not just harboring the virus and then throwing it into the population from time to time. Well, they are part of the population, but because these carriers are asymptomatic, they can easily spread the virus in the population because they have no illness, they have no disease, and so there is no reason, so to say, for to isolate or to quarantine these people. But the asymptomatic carriers in case of SARS-CoV-2, they, as I have tried to explain, they are even capable of generating more infectious variants. So especially that especially occurs if you have more stringent infection prevention measures. But at any rate, asymptomatic carriers of SARS-CoV-2 will ultimately produce more infectious variants in the population. So can you control this then with mass vaccination with the current vaccines? Well, we're dealing with highly mutable viruses. And on top, the mass vaccination will, in fact, as I've tried to explain, it will foster, it will further promote the breeding of this, the further breeding of these infectious variants, to an extent that they become even more infectious and ultimately overcome the functionality of the vaccinal antibodies, to an extent that these highly infectious variants ultimately evolve into variants that are resistant to the vaccine. So there is no way that with the conventional vaccines we can take control over this pandemic, or we can solve this pandemic. We basically make the situation much, much worse because of that very reason. And vaccination will further enhance breeding of more infectious variants and ultimately lead to resistance to the vaccine. So I would like to point out as a last point that mass vaccination of youngsters, especially mass vaccination of youngsters, is going to result in enhanced morbidity and mortality rates in these age groups. So that is really not something we should even be considering. And why is this? Well, it's very, very simple. So mass vaccination of youngsters, I repeat it, is going to result in enhanced morbidity and mortality rates in this very group of youngsters. If you look at this, for example, here you can see that the second wave was also affecting younger age groups. And so what people then say, and that is an absolute mistake, wow, wait a minute, these people are getting increasingly ill, so we need to vaccinate them. We need to vaccinate them as well. Well, if you are going to vaccinate these people, what is going to happen is that you are going to put further down their innate immune protection. As I was saying, it gets already slowly eroded by the fact that the virus continues to propagate in those asymptomatically infected people. But if now on top you're going to vaccinate them, buff, you will have all of a sudden a dramatic drop in their innate immune response. And that is, it has always to do, of course, with the competition. These people are experiencing suppression of their innate antibodies, and suboptimal vaccinal antibodies will, of course, contribute to a further suppression and a further erosion of the innate immunity in those people, and will make them highly susceptible to the disease. And that at a point in time where we have more infectious variants replicating, and more infectious variants that are circulating, means that they are less well recognized by the vaccine. So if on top you deprive these youngsters from their innate antibodies, well, you not deprive them, but you bypass them, you put them out of business, then for sure you're going to see a dramatic increase in disease in these young people. And that is something we should absolutely avoid. But in general, as I pointed out, mass vaccination with these conventional vaccines during this pandemic is certainly not the way to go. It's just going to make the situation increasingly dramatic, and it will ultimately lead to resistance of the virus to the vaccines. Thanks for your attention.